Beneath the golden glow of temple walls and the hum of prayers to Isis, expectant mothers were seen as vessels of divine magic. Statues of hippo goddesses and amulets shaped like frogs promised protection. Incantations were whispered over swollen bellies, but behind the incense and sacred symbols lay a world far more fragile. There were no doctors, only midwives, magic, and hope. Pregnancy tests involved barley and wheat. Miscarriage was a curse, stillbirth a sign of sin. Pain was expected, survival was not. Every birth was a gamble. Some recorded their fears on scraps of papyrus, others left no trace at all. This is the hidden history of pregnancy in ancient Egypt, the pain, the peril, and the power. To understand the struggles of women in ancient Egypt, we must first grasp a startling contradiction that runs through their entire civilization. Egyptian women enjoyed legal rights nearly identical to men from our earliest preserved records, able to own property, initiate divorce, and engage in trade, freedoms that would not be seen again in many societies for millennia. Yet this legal equality existed alongside medical practices and social expectations that placed women's bodies at extraordinary risk. Imagine Ankhesenamun, not the famous queen, but a more typical woman of the same name living in Memphis around 1400 BCE. At age 12, she would have been considered ready for marriage. Marriage in ancient Egypt was primarily viewed as a business arrangement between families, an alliance of clans and property. Unlike her sisters in neighboring Mesopotamia or later in classical Greece, Ankhesenamun had remarkable agency in this process. Some marriage contracts were even initiated by women rather than men, and women could divorce their husbands and send them away. But legal equality could not protect against biological reality. The average Egyptian woman would become pregnant numerous times throughout her fertile years, not by choice, but by necessity, in a society where infant mortality rates soared above 40%. Each pregnancy was a gamble with death, and everyone knew it. The archaeological record speaks volumes about what written sources often omit. In cemeteries across Egypt, we find the remains of young women who died between ages 15 and 25, many with signs of death during childbirth. These silent graves tell us more about women's lived experiences than any royal inscription celebrating the pharaoh's divine power. Consider this: while pharaohs boasted of their eternal glory carved in stone, ordinary women faced the real possibility that each pregnancy might be their last. The great irony of Egyptian civilization is that it granted women legal equality while their biology subjected them to risks that no law could address. The institution of marriage in ancient Egypt was not the romantic union our modern sensibilities might expect, but rather a calculated economic arrangement that would determine a woman's entire life trajectory. Marriage was regarded as an alliance between families, a joining of clans and union of property, with couples becoming married simply by deciding to live together. Marriage negotiations in Thebes around 1250 BCE offer a revealing glimpse into the legal and social norms of ancient Egypt. Rather than focusing on affection or compatibility, families often treated these unions as formal contracts, discussing property rights, inheritance, and the fate of children should the marriage end. Prenuptial agreements were commonly drawn up and signed, especially among the middle classes, indicating a society that not only recognized the possibility of marital dissolution, but actively planned for it. These contracts served to protect individual assets and outline responsibilities, reflecting a legal culture that approached marriage with both realism and foresight. What's remarkable is the protection these agreements offered women. If a husband left the marriage, he was liable to a fine or payment of support analogous to alimony, and in many cases he forfeited his share of joint property. This represented revolutionary thinking for the ancient world. While her contemporaries in Babylon or Athens would become virtually the property of their husbands, an Egyptian woman retained economic independence that could save her life if her marriage became unbearable. Yet behind this legal progressivism lay harsh economic calculations about female fertility. A woman's value in the marriage market was directly tied to her reproductive potential. Hieroglyphic records from Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders, reveal that wives who failed to produce children, particularly male heirs, faced social pressure that could drive them to desperate measures. The pressure to conceive was not merely social, but existential. In a society without social safety nets, childless women faced poverty and old age. Sons were expected to care for aging parents, while daughters, once married, belonged to their husband's family. A woman who failed to produce children faced the terrifying prospect of destitution, regardless of her legal rights. This created a cruel paradox. Women had the legal right to divorce, but the economic necessity to remain fertile made leaving an abusive or neglectful husband extremely dangerous. Freedom on papyrus meant little when starvation loomed as the alternative. Long before modern pregnancy tests, ancient Egyptian women faced the terrifying uncertainty of not knowing whether they were pregnant until months into the process. The methods they developed reveal both remarkable intuition and disturbing desperation in equal measure. An Egyptian papyrus from between 1500 and 1300 BCE offers a method for diagnosing pregnancy. Women were advised to urinate into a bag of barley and a bag of wheat. If the barley sprouted, the child would be male. If the wheat sprouted, female. If nothing grew, she wasn't pregnant. Modern testing has shown this method to be surprisingly accurate. Pregnant women's urine contains elevated hormones that can indeed stimulate plant growth. But consider what this tells us about women's lived experience. A woman would be crouching over bags of grain, waiting days or weeks to learn whether her delayed menstruation meant pregnancy or merely the stress and malnutrition that plagued many ordinary Egyptians. The anxiety must have been crushing. Another method involved counting how many times a woman vomited when placed on a mash of beer and dates, a recognition that nausea accompanied early pregnancy. Yet this crude understanding came with no ability to address the underlying condition. Morning sickness, which today we understand as hormonal adjustment, was interpreted through the lens of divine displeasure or evil spirits. The absence of reliable pregnancy detection created a psychological torment we can barely imagine. Women lived in constant uncertainty about their body's condition, unable to plan or prepare for the massive physical changes ahead. This uncertainty was compounded by superstition that made pregnancy seem as much a supernatural event as a biological one. Egyptian medical papyri contained dozens of spells and incantations designed to either encourage or prevent pregnancy, revealing the desperation women felt about controlling their reproductive fate. These weren't merely cultural practices, but survival strategies in a world where pregnancy could mean death. The most chilling aspect of these detection methods is what they reveal about medical knowledge. While Egyptian physicians could perform successful cataract surgery and set complex bone fractures, pregnancy remained largely mysterious. Women were left to navigate one of life's most dangerous experiences with little more than folk wisdom and prayer. When childbirth arrived, Egyptian women faced an ordeal that combined primitive medical understanding with sophisticated superstition, creating an experience that was both physically dangerous and psychologically traumatic. Most medical and magical texts concerning childbirth were spells, incantations, remedies, and prescriptions designed to accelerate delivery or protect the unborn child and parturient. A woman would begin her labor and be led to a special birthing chamber where female relatives have arranged 4 birthing bricks in a square. These bricks, sometimes decorated with protective deities, allowed women to squat during delivery, a position we now know is more effective than lying down, though the Egyptians understood this purely through trial and error. Midwives came in many forms. For peasants, they were friends, neighbors, or family members. For noble women, usually maidservants or nurses already living in the household. Unlike modern medical professionals, these midwives had no formal training, learning instead through apprenticeships where knowledge was passed down through generations. A girl would be squatting on the birthing bricks, surrounded by women chanting protective spells while burning incense to ward off evil spirits. Her midwife, perhaps her own mother or sister, has learned everything she knows from previous births, with no understanding of infection, proper hygiene, or emergency procedures. The room fills with smoke from burning herbs believed to have magical properties, while outside, male relatives anxiously await news. The physical challenges were immense. Without understanding of anatomy or sterile technique, Complications that today would be minor emergencies became death sentences. Breech births, which modern medicine handles routinely, often killed both mother and child. Infections that could be prevented with basic hygiene ravaged women who had survived the initial delivery. Evidence indicates that ancient Egyptians devised strategies to suture perineal tears and manage other postpartum complications, showing some medical sophistication. Yet, their newborn assessment consisted of only two parameters: cry and muscle tone, a system that missed countless problems we would identify immediately today. The psychological trauma compounded the physical danger. Women faced childbirth knowing that death was a common outcome, watching friends and relatives die in labor, yet having no choice but to continue bearing children. The bravery required to face repeated pregnancies under these conditions is almost incomprehensible to modern minds. What made the situation even more tragic was the recognition that some women understood the risks but had no alternatives. Hieroglyphic inscriptions occasionally record women's prayers before childbirth, asking not for easy delivery but simply to survive the experience. Ancient Egyptian approaches to pregnancy and childbirth reveal a fascinating but often dangerous blend of practical knowledge and supernatural belief. This combination, while sometimes helpful, often placed women in additional jeopardy when medical emergencies arose. Ancient Egyptians welcomed childbirth with ritual, using medico-magical spells, amulets, and various other objects to help ensure survival. The goddess Taweret, depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, became the primary protector of women in labor. Her fearsome appearance was intended to frighten away demons that supposedly caused complications during childbirth. In Alexandria, around 300 BCE, it was not uncommon for women to face multiple infant losses, prompting a blend of spiritual and practical responses to pregnancy. Wealthier families often commissioned protective amulets depicting deities like Taweret or Bez, believed to guard mother and child during labor. Female relatives played a key role, preparing collections of magical spells and incantations to be recited throughout the birthing process. Birthing chambers were sometimes adorned with protective symbols, and objects like cowrie shell necklaces were worn to invoke fertility and safeguard delivery. These practices reflect a culture where pregnancy was both sacred and perilous, and protection was sought through a fusion of ritual, magic, and community support. Yet this supernatural protection system, while providing psychological comfort, also diverted attention from practical medical care. When complications arose, the response was often to increase magical interventions rather than seeking physical solutions. Women experiencing prolonged labor might be given increasingly exotic potions and subjected to more elaborate rituals, while the underlying medical problem remained unaddressed. The medical papyri reveal hundreds of remedies for pregnancy-related problems, most containing ingredients that were either useless or actively dangerous. Prescriptions called for everything from crocodile dung, believed to prevent pregnancy, to various animal organs that could introduce deadly infections. The irony is striking. A civilization capable of precise astronomical calculations and architectural marvels relied on magic and superstition for women's reproductive health. Some interventions, however, showed genuine medical insight. Egyptian physicians understood that certain herbs could induce labor or reduce pain, and archaeological evidence suggests they developed early forms of caesarean sections, though likely only performed when the mother had already died. The tragedy is that this practical knowledge was buried beneath layers of supernatural belief that often prevented its effective application. The psychological impact of this supernatural framework cannot be understated. Women who suffered miscarriages or difficult labors were often blamed for insufficient devotion to protective deities or failure to properly ward off evil influences. This added guilt and shame to already devastating experiences, creating additional trauma that could affect women's mental health for years. The brutal realities of pregnancy and childbirth in ancient Egypt were not distributed equally across society. Social class created stark differences in both the quality of care women received and their chances of survival, revealing how economic privilege could literally mean the difference between life and death. Royal and noble women had access to the most skilled physicians in Egypt, men who had studied at the temples and learned the most advanced medical techniques available. These women gave birth in palace chambers with proper ventilation, clean linens, and attendants who understood basic hygiene. They could afford the finest amulets, the most elaborate protective rituals, and the services of experienced midwives who had attended dozens of successful births. Yet even privilege couldn't overcome the fundamental limitations of ancient medicine. Nefertiti herself, one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history, likely lost several children in infancy or childbirth, a common experience even among royalty. The mummy of Queen Tiye shows evidence of multiple pregnancies and the physical toll they exacted, despite her access to the finest care available. Middle-class women, the wives of scribes, craftsmen, and minor officials, occupied a precarious position. They had some resources to secure competent midwives and basic medical care, but lacked the royal access to temple physicians and exotic treatments. These women often faced difficult choices: spend the family's savings on protective amulets and experienced attendants, or risk childbirth with minimal support and hope for the best. For peasant women, who comprised the vast majority of Egypt's population, pregnancy was often a death sentence disguised as a natural process. These women worked in the fields until labor began, gave birth in mud brick hovels with minimal assistance, and returned to manual labor within days of delivery, if they survived. Their midwives were neighbors or relatives with no formal training, operating with superstition and folklore as their only guides. The archaeological record from worker villages like Deir el-Medina provides heartbreaking glimpses into these women's lives. Ostraca, limestone flakes used for informal writing, record requests for time off work due to women's problems, euphemisms for pregnancy complications, miscarriages, and recovery from childbirth. These brief notes represent the only historical acknowledgement of suffering that affected millions of women. Perhaps most tragically, social class influenced not just the quality of medical care, but also women's reproductive choices. Wealthy women could afford to space their pregnancies, use primitive forms of birth control, and even occasionally choose childlessness if they wished. Poor women had no such luxury. They bore children constantly because infant mortality meant only multiple pregnancies offered hope of surviving offspring to care for them in old age. The system created a vicious cycle. Women who survived multiple pregnancies and childbirth experiences gained knowledge and skills that could help others, but this wisdom was largely confined within social classes. The survival strategies developed by royal physicians rarely reached peasant villages, while the practical folk remedies used by common women were dismissed by educated physicians as primitive superstition. Behind the personal tragedies of individual women lay a brutal economic calculation that treated female reproductive capacity as a resource to be exploited rather than a human experience to be protected. Understanding this economic framework reveals why ancient Egyptian society, despite its relative progressivism regarding women's legal rights, failed to address the massive mortality rates associated with pregnancy and childbirth. From the state's perspective, women's primary value lay in producing the next generation of taxpayers, soldiers, and workers. Pharaonic records meticulously tracked population numbers, not out of concern for individual welfare, but to calculate tax revenues and military conscription potential. Each woman represented an investment in future economic productivity, but only if she successfully bore and raised children to adulthood. This economic logic created perverse incentives that increased rather than decreased risks to women's health. Families were encouraged to have as many children as possible, not only to ensure some survived to adulthood, but also to maximize their economic output. A household with multiple adult children could farm more land, engage in more crafts, and generate more income. The pressure on women to continue bearing children regardless of their health status was enormous. Papyrus records from Lahun reveal the harsh realities many women faced in ancient Egypt. One such case describes a woman who bore 5 children in 7 years, 3 of whom died in infancy. Despite suffering from what the texts refer to as a weakness of the womb, she became pregnant again. Her husband sought the advice of physicians not to assess the risks to her health, but to obtain magical interventions aimed at ensuring the survival of the unborn child. The mother's well-being was a secondary concern, overshadowed by the family's pressing need for heirs. Such accounts underscore a broader societal pattern in which fertility was prized, infant mortality was tragically common, and a woman's reproductive value often outweighed her personal safety. The economic framework also explains why investment in women's healthcare remained minimal despite Egypt's wealth and medical sophistication. Resources flowed toward projects that enhanced pharaonic power, monuments, military campaigns, administrative systems, rather than toward improving maternal mortality rates. The loss of individual women, while tragic for their families, didn't threaten the broader economic or political system. Ironically, this same economic logic occasionally worked in women's favor. By 365 BCE, new marriage contracts emerged that mainly protected women from divorce, placing more financial burdens on men. This change likely reflected recognition that training skilled female workers, weavers, brewers, bakers, represented significant investment that shouldn't be casually discarded through arbitrary divorce. Yet the fundamental calculation remained unchanged. Women's bodies were valuable primarily as reproductive vessels, not as human beings with intrinsic worth. This framework would persist long after the fall of the pharaohs, influencing attitudes toward women's healthcare for millennia to come. As we emerge from the shadow-filled birthing chambers of ancient Egypt, we carry with us the voices of women whose names have largely vanished from history, but whose experiences echo across millennia. Their struggles illuminate not just the past, but also the present. Yet the legacy of those ancient women extends beyond their suffering. Their informal networks of knowledge and support prefigured modern women's health movements. Their legal equality, however limited by practical circumstances, established precedents that would eventually inspire broader concepts of human rights. Perhaps most importantly, their stories remind us that behind every historical statistic lies a human reality. These aren't merely historical curiosities, but testimonies to human experiences as real and urgent as our own.